evening, and welcome to another GBKM special broadcast with me, your host, Romain Redmond. As I'm saying, today we're in unprecedented times, and with unprecedented times brings unprecedented reactions, right? But of course, during all this, there are still issues, which were left before COVID and still needs to be addressed. Today, we're here to address one of those timely issues, and it's of course parental alienation. Parental alienation affects children all throughout the world, and here in Canada it's no different. Parental alienation is something which affects how children grow, are nurtured, and how they assimilate to being productive adults in society. Today, of course, I'm being joined in studios over the phone by one Miss Lovely Frances Bradshaw, Senior Advisor to the Mayor of Brampton, as we break down this topical issue. Of course, today, April 25th, is being celebrated as Parental Alienation Awareness Day. So, Frances, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much for joining me on this special broadcast. How are you doing?
I am great. Today was, as you recognize, Parental Alienation Awareness Day, and at the City of Brampton, we actually were going to be having a flag raising, but with all of our parks closed, we've moved the campaign over to a digital format. So we really appreciate you guys giving us this time. I work in the mayor's office as a senior advisor, but I also am a strong advocate within the community against parental alienation, and supporting a campaign got started through a woman in our city named Chef Nessa Brown. So no relation to the mayor, but
Yes.
just as hard of a worker.
Absolutely, and we must commend the City of Brampton also for joining initiatives like this. I know the mayor is one who is really fanatical about really changing a lot of the ills that are in a society, and him joining a campaign like this, the city joining a campaign like this, and of course yourself, Frances, who has been such vocal person in our community, especially in this great city of Brampton. But of course, Frances, parental alienation, those are two power-packed words. So I want you to just break down that concept for us, and then we'll dive into what the whole issue entails.
Yeah, parental alienation, and I think when this first started coming up, it was originally sort of framed by a lot of people as a men's rights issue. And what we've started to see is a significant amount of men and women both affected. Parental alienation is a process that often happens either during separation and after divorce. And, divorce isn't easy on anybody. And most parents, despite a lot of the distress, they want to try and smooth the way for their kids. But, sometimes with as many intense feelings that come with separation, one parent either consciously or even unconsciously encourages the child to unjustly reject the other parent. And so that's what we talk about when we talk about parental alienation. Sometimes it can be intentional, sometimes it is unintentional, but unfortunately the biggest issue that we face is the impact it has on the child. It can have really adverse psychological effects on the child. It affects mental health and wellness, their educational attainment. So it has long-standing impact on the child, on the parents, on siblings, step-siblings. So it runs very deep.
So when you say, let's go into the ways in which parental alienation manifests itself. So you mentioned before that it's typical after things like divorce and separation. But when we say alienation, is it just being that, let's say the child no longer speaks with the father or the mom? Is it only in that form?
Well, it can be in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's the child consciously choosing not to based off of what one parent has been telling them or directing them, and that can be one parent, and sometimes it's very subtle. You should suggest to your dad that he is better with his time, indicating on visits, indicating that for whatever reason, one parent doesn't value the time with their child as much. Or it can be as severe as psychological manipulation. If you don't go visit with your dad, I'll buy you that video game that you really wanted.
Yeah.
Or reinforcing with the child, your dad was really, really mean to me. And let's say there's cheating that went on in the relationship.
Yes.
Your dad doesn't treat your mom very well. You love your mom, don't you? Isn't it bad that your dad is so mean to your mom? And so taking those adult feelings and experiences and applying those pressures onto the child or the child's relationship with the other parent starts to create a very negative psyche for the child when it comes to their other parent.
Absolutely. So in regards to the effect that you spoke of earlier, because obviously if children are being influenced in that way, so as to have that, as you said, a negative reaction to, let's say, a parent, what are some of the impacts that has on them personally? I mean, mental and just really being children that they should be.
Yeah, I think when one parent starts to create a narrative, the other parent doesn't love the child enough, and that's why they might not be able to do visits, or maybe creating a situation where it's very difficult for the other parent to actually have visiting time, saying, well, I'm not going to meet you there, and it has to be on my terms. Or, you have some parents who have said, well, you can only see the child at my home under certain conditions, when prior to that, they were equal in their parenting rights and decision making. It can have a lot of impacts later on for children, and that's feeling senses of unworth, feeling like they are unloved and not valued, not understanding. We got a lot of kids that end up with a feeling of anger, and this can become to the extreme level where we've seen a parent who has alienated the other parent and convinced the child that parent was so terrible. We've had cases where children have assisted their other parent in killing the alienated and targeted parent. So it can be very extreme. And really the psychological impact. And I think right now in our society, we've started to take a much closer look at mental health and mental well-being and wellness. And those feelings that children experience going through a very negative divorce, where children are used as pawns or currency. And that can be, part of that, I think, is how our child system works when it comes to separation. Kids are looked at as property that has to be either shared or divided, and a monetary value is also placed on who has ownership.
And let's not forget, but let's not forget, children are also being used as like a prize in the divorce. You get to see the child if you give me the penthouse. You get to see the child if you settle for $2 million in the divorce.
Yeah, a negotiation piece for one parent to get a bigger cut of the pie. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in parental alienation groups is that the best child support is equal parenting. I think the stats show, money, and we talk a lot about that. Money doesn't matter, right? And the money is not the most important thing. It's the time and the love that we put on that. And I think, unfortunately, when we go to family courts, I think the impact of having lawyers involved in this process whose goal is to fight for what their client wants, not what is in the best interest of the child. I think we've lost the interest of the child being placed first. And that has really severely contributed to a lot of negative outcomes. I personally, and a lot of the people that I work with, agree that parenting should be presumed 50-50 during separation, unless we're having documented instances of violence or abuse. And even then, education is a very important part for that. One of the challenges that I have seen quite a bit, and I've witnessed this in the family court system, is allegations are very easily made in the family court system that are never run through the criminal justice system. So one parent will accuse the other parent of abuse or neglect. I've seen cases where one parent accused the other parent of not feeding the child and being neglectful. Now, in any other situation, that would be a criminal offense, and that would be looked at through a policing lens. But instead, they look at it as a disagreement between parents, and it's used as a tool to try and manipulate the system. And so we see that quite often.
Absolutely, but in regards to some parents too, and I'm just going to go on this side for a while. In regards to some parents, because a lot of parents, especially, let's say, first-time parents, don't have the experience of, let's say, raising a child, right? So when it comes to parenting, some persons on the outside would be like, well, they're not the best parents. But so what are some of the support systems in place then, right, for parents who are they're not sure how to go about this parenting thing? Let's put it as that they're not sure about how to go about being a parent, or even in the negotiation process during like divorce and separation. What are some of the support systems out there for parents to be more civil in their approach?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges is that because it's not as recognized, it's not looked at as something to create supports with. And no, I know that there are parenting after separation classes that can take place. That's something that I think should always be mandatory, and I think parental alienation should be integrated into those parenting after separation classes and mandatory for any couple that has a child and wants to divorce. The first thing that should be put in place is how do we minimize the negative impact on our child. And I think part of the challenge is the adults often are going through a lot of emotional turmoil, and they're looking at things from how they're feeling and how the hurt that they're experiencing, which is very real.
Yes.
I don't think we want to negate that pain that separation and divorce creates.
Absolutely.
But a lot of organizations, what's great with what's been going on in Brampton and the work that Chef Vanessa, the leader of the parental alienation organization in our city, has been doing, is connecting to community supports and community organizations, whether that's churches, the Boys and Girls Club, the Rotary organization, every organization that has a parent in it or has children that are attached to it should be educated on parental alienation.
So it's really about getting the education out there to these parents so that they can be better, or they can navigate better instances of like separation and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly, and training social workers as well. You know, we see social workers becoming involved sometimes in the lives of families, and social workers need to be able to recognize what this is. And one of our goals is to have every social worker trained, every lawyer trained in parental alienation, to recognize it and make that one of the markers of success in the engagement with the child. We think teachers, you know, we're going to be trying to push at the school board to have parental alienation as something that's actually taught in schools. So kids, if they're experiencing it, because a lot of kids don't know what that is, and they're often victims or pawns in that situation. If kids are able to recognize that because they've been taught it in the classroom, they're going to be also be able to ask for help with that situation. And you know, our goal is to create a variety of different resources. We'd actually talked about this COVID situation and how this is going to change the work we're doing. And we really are passionate about creating a helpline so that parents and kids alike would be able to call in and get support and resources. We see so much money being poured in from parents' pocketbooks on divorce and separation, and that is money that frankly should be going to children's education.
Absolutely.
You know, we have the amount that most people would be spending on university and college when the child is young because their parents have separated, and I think that really is a tragedy system.
Absolutely. Francis?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So Francis, let us go over a little bit and talk a little bit more about Parental Alienation Awareness Day. So when did this start? Because this is not a day that is as prevalent as, let's say, Flag Day, right? Or anything like that. When did Parental Alienation Awareness Day actually start and gain that traction to where it is right now?
So the concept of parental alienation, I think, came out probably back in the 80s. I think they started to look at what this was, started to research it a little bit more. You know, I don't actually know the history of when Parental Alienation Day started. I know for myself, it's something that was going on for members of my family. And so I recognized what parental alienation was, but I didn't have a word for it. And I think it wasn't until Chef Nessa came to the city of Brampton and she started talking with our office about this huge problem that was impacting thousands and thousands of people in very severe ways. And she put a word to this experience that I knew people I were friends with had experienced, people in my family had experienced. And that's when I started recognizing that it wasn't a one-off um, personal issue. This was an issue for all of society.
For
And
us
I
to
think
really
the
sit down and
campaign has really moved
recognize that
forward.
there are a huge number of children were being disadvantaged, right?
Yes, exactly. Um, and that's, I think, the part where the shift is starting to happen, where it's not being looked at, and we talk about this as it's not a men's rights issue, it's not a women's rights
Yes.
issue,
A
it's an issue
universal
of
one.
child's rights, the rights of the children.
Absolutely. But Francis, so in recognizing Parental Alienation Day, uh, to get other people on board, some persons who might not, let's say, understand what it really is, persons who may not have experienced it outside of the whole experience of what that means and what it's really about. Why do we celebrate? Why is it that persons need to join on to movements like these to really support our children?
Yeah, I think it's so critical. You might know, or for your own family, um, but for society as a whole. When we see children that are not succeeding in school, when we see kids that end up getting involved in sometimes crime or delinquent behavior, a lot of that is a result, emotional distress. We have a lot of kids that are experiencing depression, anxiety, and stress, and a lot of that can sometimes be contributed to that experience of parental alienation. And it's not just something that happens necessarily after divorce. Sometimes it happens within families that are still together,
Yes.
where it's high conflict and children are expected to take one side or the other of the parents in what should be adult problems. The kids are
Yes.
brought in on those. And that creates a lot of stress for a child. Children, are supposed to be focusing on their future and growth and what their dreams are going to be. And sometimes parents, consciously and or unconsciously, can put those burdens of their own on their children. And there's different types of parental alienation. So we have stuff like a naive alienator who wants the child to have a good relationship, possibly with the other parent, but will occasionally, they do or say something a little bit hurtful.
Okay.
Tell dad it would be helpful if he was on time to pick you up. It starts to create
Yes.
kind of this negative sense or pressure on the child to regulate the other parent's behavior or
Absolutely.
to judge the other parent as opposed to just be loved.
And then
And
that's where the friction develops, right? Because then you have the
Exactly.
child kind of being the defense against the other parent, and then they have to be the go-between because mom and dad doesn't
Exactly.
have a good relationship, so the child is squashed in the middle in that constant friction.
Exactly. And then I think the next kind of level, I guess, we could talk about is the active alienators. So they may also, believe that their kids should have a good relationship with the other parent, but they have a really hard time, letting go of their own personal heart and frustration about the other parent. And so they might lash out about the other parent in front of their child. So they'll be talking to their friend and say, "Oh, my ex, he hasn't been paying me child support," or which can have an impact on how that parent feels about the other parent. But we've seen, and a lot of studies have shown, that regardless of child support payment, active involvement in children's life is one of the most important pieces. Having a parent actively involved in their child's life directly impacts their outcome.
Absolutely. So Francis,
Significantly, about months for what it comes to separation, we said it definitely does. Yeah.
absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about this campaign. What does it entail, especially today being celebrated as Parental Alienation Day? What should we do? What should we not do? How do we get involved in this campaign? How do we spread the word?
Yeah, so today we've asked everybody to share the blue ribbon and wear royal blue, which I have on today, as a sign of solidarity. And next year, hopefully, we're going to be able to have a great flag raising on April 25th and bring people together. We try and make it a positive experience as well. We do the Bubbles of Love project, having children blow bubbles and families. So to be able to recognize that there is hope. But we're also doing campaigns on the political level and on the educational level. So making sure that we're getting this in front of teachers.
Yes.
We think it's very, very important that kids are educated from a young age about it so that if they're experiencing it, they can ask for help. We need our lawyers educated on that. We're looking at trying to create a parental alienation certification for lawyers and social workers.
Yes.
So that all social workers would be educated on what the signs of parental alienation are. Yes. And how to address those. And it's not about punishing one parent or the other. Yes. It's about positive impacts for the child in the end. And getting our politicians involved as well. Yes. I think a lot of the times there's been a gender bias sometimes in how this issue is addressed. Yes. And taking away the idea that it is a gendered issue, it's a mother's rights issue, it's a father's rights issue, and that it's in fact.
And Francis, just expound upon that a little bit more for us in terms of the gender biases that is associated with an issue like this.
Yeah, I think it's one of the areas where we see, I would say the rates are much higher for men experience parental alienation. Now, we're starting to see a lot more women as well. And we also have, gay families who are now starting to experience that, which takes out that gender discussion, because if you have two parents of the same gender who are going through divorce, who in our society, we have kind of a traditional view that the mother will get the child. Yes. And so when we do that, we kind of look at fathers sometimes as being only there to provide monetary support. But the fact of the matter is, we see a lot of the times with children who only have one parent actively involved in their lives, whether that's their mother or their father, having negative psychological experiences because of that feeling of loss. And some of the times the children are raised to think that their other parent has abandoned them. And one of the things that I have learned through my experiences and being in the court system and watching this go on is we see a lot of parents who fight equally for their children, but don't end up with equal outcomes. And the children don't always know what has happened at the courts. The kids aren't involved in that process. Yes. Having the voice of the child being part of the decision-making process, I think, changes that a lot. Yeah. I've seen court cases where the mother has said, "Oh, the father is terrible. He's not really there. He doesn't actively do anything. We don't really need him." The father is saying, "Well, I really want to be part of my child's life." And then when the child's opinion is brought into that,
so it's a he said, she said situation without the third party, which is a child who they're arguing over.
Exactly, whose life is, I think, the most impacted about where they stay. And I think that's another reason why we are also looking to push for 50-50 parenting being the presumption. I think at any separation, it should start at 50-50 access. Yes. And negotiate how that 50-50 looks. There's different kind of parenting structures and ideas about that. Yeah. But it takes a lot of strength for adults in the situation to be able to take the emotional hurt and pain they experience in a divorce and separate that from what their child is experiencing. And I think that also means getting help for parents. I think alienators don't intend to hurt their child for the most part. I think the extreme alienators definitely do. Yes. They look at their children as property and ownership rather than people whose lives they want to improve in the future. Yes. But I think there's hope. There is definitely a lot of hope. We're starting to see more people get involved. We've seen a lot more political leaders starting to look at this very differently than they did in the past. Yes. And I think we're starting to see a change, but we need to have that public push as well. We can't just leave it in the hands of the people who are the decision makers. We
Absolutely.
have to tell them
but on that front, though, Francis, will there be a push for formal legislation for an issue like this? Do you see the movement pushing for formal legislations?
Definitely. We're seeing organizations getting together, which include lawyers, which include politicians. They're starting to learn. And I think one of the challenges is there's a lot of shame and isolation when people are experiencing separation. Yes. And so they don't talk a lot about what they're going through. Yes. And so having that conversation with them. And one of the things that we love to do is we like to just show videos.
Yes.
There's about 3 great videos. There's also an amazing organization that's a video that's called Erasing Families.
Yes.
And it is a very powerful documentary that talks about the real tragic experience of a lot of families from all sides, you know. And one of the things that we really tell people is oftentimes when children find out the extent of alienation that they've experienced, it's devastating for them. You know, they create this mentality in their mind around one of their parents not loving them and not caring about them and being a certain type of figure. And then when that other parent does get the chance to be in their child's life and show who they really are, it can be a really traumatic experience of loss.
Yes.
In that the idea that they had about their parent who maybe had the majority of custody is a bit shattered. So the goal is for that everybody in the child's family feels that they are doing the best interest of the child.
So you mentioned before that it's not really about punishing parents, and you did say there's a push for legislation. So what will those legislation or those push in terms of creating legislation, what will those be like? From your perspective, you're of course senior advisor to the mayor of Brampton, so you're adequate, you're adept as to what policy formulation is and considering policies is actually like. So give us a perspective from your expertise as well as you eliminating punishment as to what a legislation like this would look like.
Yeah, and I think because there's so many varied types of alienation, I think it depends to the degree that it's being experienced, right?
Yeah.
Severe alienation, you know, a lot of people who are involved in the parental alienation push have been personally affected by it, right? And a lot of people say that they want parental alienation to be a punishable crime.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm quite at that stage yet, because I think
there's work to be done before that stage.
Exactly, and I think there is steps that have to happen before that you get to that stage, but there has to be repercussions at the same time. We see extreme forms of alienation, and that does need to be accounted for.
Yes.
But I think what we need to see is that first step is giving parents equal access to their children.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about legislation, we sometimes always think about punishment rather than being proactive. Yeah. And I think there's different areas where this is going to have to be addressed. Yeah. But I think especially in how the family courts are run and operated, we need to be taking out financial incentive for there to be a quote unquote win for one side versus the other. It's not about one side or the other. It is about children.
Absolutely.
And when you separate finances from the relationships with children,
from the human nature, right? Separate finances, the markets from human nature.
Exactly. And what I have seen a lot of the times is that the courts do say that access is not tied to support.
Yes.
And that if you don't pay support, you still are allowed your access. But the enforcement is where we see a huge difference.
Yes.
And especially amongst racialized communities, I know Canada and the U.S. are different. Yeah. But in the United States, if you are behind on child support, you can be arrested in some states. Yeah. And so that has had very negative incomes in the decisions that certain parents do and don't make. And I think that creates additional barriers because we see a much stronger enforcement on the monetary side, but when it comes to the actual physical access, it's very rarely enforced. And so we see certain parents have a higher financial burden and the other parent has a lower financial burden, or in fact, their financial situation is directly tied to how much time they have with their child. Yes. They're going to push to have all of the time in order to also compensate for themselves financially.
Absolutely, Francis, and thank you so much for that. But I just wanted to leave us with some final thoughts before we wrap today's episode. Some final thoughts, please.
Yeah, so I think parental alienation is something that is very real. It impacts children, and as I said in my video, it has no age, it has no race, it has no socioeconomic status. It affects parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, but most tragically, it affects children. And so I think it is imperative on our society as a whole to start really looking at this issue from the eyes of the child. And once we start to do that, I think we're going to see positive outcomes when it comes to our educational attainment for children, our psychological health, and the future of our society as a whole.
Absolutely. And Francis, thank you so much for joining me here at studios virtually as we're keeping our social distance. But of course, some very informative material was definitely shared with us here. And Francis, thank you so much once again for calling in.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
It was my pleasure. And of course, thank you at home for tuning in to another special broadcast here from the Gbkm FM studios. Of course, it is about parent alienation, and today being celebrated as Parent Alienation Awareness Day, we definitely have to pay pause. Right? Click pause so that we can look at, educate ourselves, and also get active in preventing things like these and issues like these from affecting our nation's children. Of course, children are indeed our future and they must be protected. This is a fully endorsed message by Gbkm FM. And as we take our leave here in Gbkm FM, you can definitely keep up with our platforms. Don't forget, it's Facebook at Gbkm TV, on YouTube, Gbkm TV. Get us on our website, www.gbkm.fm. You can also get us on TuneIn app, and you can also get our app from our website and take us with you wherever you go. I was your host for this special broadcast right here on Gbkm FM, the mouthpiece. Bye-bye. Good evening and welcome to another Gbkm special broadcast with me, your host, Romain Redmond. As I'm saying, today we're in unprecedented times, and with unprecedented times brings unprecedented reactions, right? But of course, during all this, there are still issues which were left before COVID and still needs to be addressed. Today, we're here to address one of those timely issues, and it's of course parental alienation.